So remember how there was this whole thing called COVID and like everyone was dying and the whole world was like, when will we find a cure? And like everyone was scrambling to make a vaccine. And then America actually did make a vaccine and everyone was like, yay! And then they were like, so America, how do you make it? And America was like, we can't actually tell you. And then like all these people died. Let's talk about that. So in 2019, according to the extensive research of many talented investigative journalists, a bat maybe flew into a fish market or something, and the whole world got Corona-19. Of course, this was not our first global pandemic. There had been Spanish flu, polio, cholera, SARS, AIDS. But this was the first one to affect rich, straight Western people in a long time. So America, eventually, decided to take it seriously. And America needed to take it seriously because the US has the largest capacity to research, develop, produce, and distribute drugs and vaccines. And thus they can be your biggest ally or your biggest enemy. More on that later. For example, when the first discovered antibiotic penicillin began to be used medicinally by a group of researchers at Oxford, they were unable to produce enough of it to even save one patient. That is, until America stepped in with its federal funding and extensive pharmaceutical industry. So when it came to COVID, everyone knew we couldn't do this without the help of big pharma. There was just one problem. Western pharmaceutical companies don't give a monkey tit about vaccines. Preventative medicine is not nearly as profitable as treatments. And pharmaceutical companies do not invest in research and development, also known as R&D, for the public welfare. They do it for the public. Which is why most modern medical discoveries and inventions that actually help people, such as penicillin, blood transfusion technology, oral rehydration therapy, ventilators, pacemakers, kidney dialysis, MRIs, ultrasounds, I could go on, were first created by university researchers. And fun drugs that people actually like heroin, codeine, cocaine, Oxycontin, Viagra, were all invented and distributed by Western pharmaceutical companies. Yes, the German company Bayer did originally start manufacturing and promoting heroin. Thanks, guys. Basically, universities make discoveries and come up with ideas using government grants. And Western pharmaceutical companies figure out how to refine, process, manufacture, mass produce, and promote such products. So during COVID, the American government realized that big pharma wouldn't help with a COVID vaccine out of the goodness of their heart. God forbid. So they passed a bill called
Operation Warp Speed,
which is how bills get named when your government is run by emotionally stunted septuagenarians. A bill that set aside $18 billion for vaccine research and development. Do you want that in crores? It's a lot of crores. Some of this money ended up finding its way to two companies, Pfizer and Moderna. Moderna was a biotech company founded in 2010 that had never produced a drug, but it worked arm in arm with federal scientists and agencies to pioneer different uses for a new kind of mRNA technology. Pfizer was a much older company founded in 1849 that got its start selling things like morphine and opium tinctures, and eventually made its way over the years to selling people actual medicine, you know, like Viagra.
There are many treatments available for ED, so my advice is get a medical checkup. It's the best way to get educated about ED.
Both Pfizer and Moderna end up creating a rather pricey vaccine, one that uses this new mRNA technology, a technology that had been created over the decades using American government funding and derived from the work of private university researchers and in partnership with federal scientists. And while Russia and China did manage to produce a vaccine even more quickly, look, most countries simply do not have the R&D capabilities and resources to create a vaccine this quickly, or at all. And it doesn't help that America restricted the raw materials for the vaccine from being exported now, does it? In August of 2021, the American government approved what seems to be the most effective COVID vaccine up to that date. But there was one teeny weeny little problem: the intellectual property. For a quick recap, intellectual property is the idea that ideas are invisible objects that can be owned or stolen. Those ideas can be anything from like jetpacks that don't actually exist yet to like certain kinds of beans that have existed for thousands of years. If this isn't making sense to you, that's because it doesn't make sense. Intellectual property is a way for corporations, especially Western ones, to monopolize certain industries. And every time someone objects to this, the companies release the same PR statements saying that the removal of this patent will set a dangerous precedent and that intellectual property is the foundation of innovation. While patents only give companies the rights to something for a certain period of time that differs by country and industry, they are especially pernicious in medicine, where a difference of a few years can mean tens of thousands of lives, especially since companies find creative ways of extending their patents by releasing new and improved versions of the drug. The most illustrative example of the way that patents go against public interest was during the AIDS crisis, when the company Burroughs Williams, which is now called GlaxoSmithKline plc, held the patent to a discontinued cancer drug, AZT, that they hadn't even invented. They had just bought the patent. Government scientists found out that AZT could do wonders for people infected with HIV. But the company, once it was persuaded to release the drug at all, or even give them samples of it to test on patients, released the drug well above manufacturing price, at a modern day equivalent of $23,000 per year per patient, making it the most expensive drug on the market, even as many people were dying of this terrible disease. When the Indian pharmaceutical company Cephas began releasing a generic version of an even more effective drug cocktail and releasing it for just $800 a year per patient, and announced that they would help countries like South Africa produce the drug, 39 international brand name drug companies, with the support of the US government, sued South Africa, claiming, you guessed it, that this was a violation of international trade agreements, more on that later, and that intellectual property was the key to innovation. And thus it was actually helping African people by letting them die to protect the intellectual property instead. God, I hate neoliberalism. The companies eventually dropped the lawsuit, not because they had a change of heart, but because the international coverage of the protests against them made them look like literal ghouls, which of course they were ghouls. The companies continued to do similar things years later. When the life-changing drug PrEP was released on the market, they priced it at 25,000% of the manufacturing cost. Now, many post-colonial companies adopt different kinds of patent laws when it comes to medicine. The entire reason that India has such an affordable generics industry. And by the way, Indian generics in the US represent 40% of the US market, since even Americans can't afford American drugs, is because of Indian law. In 1970, Indira Gandhi altered the patent laws to ensure that medical products could not be patented, only the process by which those products were made. Kind of a tongue twister. Seashells by the fuck. The idea of a better ordered world is one in which medical discoveries will be free of patents and there will be no profiteering from life and death. I mean, the lady had her problems. But you know, I gotta give her this one. Unfortunately, at least for the Indian generics industry, this happened.
In Moscow, the hammer and sickle is lowered for the last time, and an era comes to an end.
And the West then bullied the post-colonial world into signing a trade agreement called TRIPS, which made the intellectual property regime of the West a worldwide phenomenon. The exact same thing that happened during the AIDS crisis also happened during COVID, except this time the companies didn't back down. They simply were not supported by the US government as much. During COVID, when India and South Africa jointly proposed that TRIPS be waived for the COVID vaccine. These are both post-colonial countries with a large pharmaceutical industry that don't have the government funding to do R&D. But when they made this proposal, countries, mostly developed countries such as the US, the UK, EU countries, and Switzerland, denied the role of intellectual property being a barrier in the access to medical products. Germany specifically said, "The protection of intellectual property is a source of innovation and must remain so, yeah." Luckily, then this happened. And the new president, Joe Biden, called for a waiver of the TRIPS agreement, eventually. Even when billions of lives are potentially at stake, Western pharma sticks to the same argument, that the threat to intellectual property is more dangerous than the actual disease. And this wasn't the only time that the US interfered with access to vaccine information for the post-colonial world. Oxford in 2020 pledged to produce an open source vaccine. It was 97% publicly funded and was on schedule to be shared worldwide. That is, until a wonderful little innovator who'd spent 20 plus years preventing innovation in the IT sector by monopolizing the industry, named Bill Gates, stepped in.
We went to Oxford and said, hey, you're doing brilliant work, but you really need to team up.
I don't know what team up means. By context, I assume it's yuppie for go back on your promises and betray billions of people. After this suggestion from the Gates Foundation, Oxford partnered with British-Swedish company AstraZeneca and did not waive their patent. It signed an exclusive vaccine deal with AstraZeneca that gave the pharmaceutical giant sole rights and no guarantee of low prices, with the less publicized potential for Oxford to eventually make millions from the deal and win plenty of prestige. As reported by the Health News Florida, the only Western source that seems to cover this very much. Is this a good time to mention that journalism is fundamentally broken right now due to transforming technologies interrupting traditional sources of funding? I guess that's kind of a tangent. Now, maybe Bill Gates had very good reasons for persuading Oxford to not release the patent open source. Maybe pigs are just overweight dogs in disguise. We may never know, because our tech philosophy king overlords simply don't deign to explain anything to the public. Meanwhile, Moderna actually sued the American government in order to try to gain sole rights over the technology they'd created alongside government scientists. And Pfizer began talking about their plans to raise their prices to $130 per shot. And both companies started pushing boosters that the medical community is far from agreed upon are actually necessary. Meanwhile, many complained that the government had funded private companies while ignoring open source efforts, like the one developed by the Texas Children's Hospital Center for vaccine development, which cost only $7 million to innovate and was much more suited to be produced in post-colonial nations that don't have this unnecessarily complicated mRNA technology, as well as refrigeration abilities. But this vaccine, it was argued, got little funding and little press. The same countries that were so adamant about blocking the sharing of medical technology and information eventually started donating their excess vaccines to WHO's COVAX program, the one aimed to help developing nations.
Noblesse oblige.
It's kind of like breaking someone's sewing machine and then donating them your old underwear. Instead of just assisting countries like India in making these vaccines or the most appropriate vaccines, they donated a few million, far less than most countries need, which means variations continue to emerge. And the only people who win are the companies, which produce more and more boosters and are making record gains. Is there any truth to the claim that short-term expense of, millions of lives will be made up for in the long term when it comes to gains in innovation? No, obviously not. You can stop watching this video now. Science is collaborative. It involves exchanges of information between different people, different institutions, different countries. Pharma always pushes the same line, that it's desire for profit that drives innovation. They argue, we sacrificed the money, we took the risks, we deserve the rewards. But none of this is true. Instead, actual innovation is created through elaborate webs of private and public funding, public and private enterprises, and many different teams of scientists making discoveries, writing papers, and sharing them with the community. And more often than not, these discoveries are based on traditional medicines, such as aspirin or quinine. The patent system doesn't actually encourage more innovation. It encourages more patents, which can be anything from isolated compounds derived from medicinal plants to a competitor's drug to which you've added one molecule. We like to think of scientific discoveries as done by innovators, lone geniuses, or at least lucky people who make
Contributions to science.
But that's just not how it works. We say that the Scottish scientist Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928. But the whole story is much more complicated. Molds have historically been used in traditional medicines, causing many Western researchers in the 1800s to experiment with different molds and their antibacterial effects. Fleming's own work was inspired by 3 Irish physicians, and his work lay somewhat forgotten until another science was able, after much difficulty, to replicate his experiment. And another group of scientists was able to isolate the compound, and penicillin didn't start even saving lives until the American government, in partnership with many pharmaceutical groups, was able to figure out how to produce it en masse. Imagine if in between each of these steps, every time any of these dozens of academic researchers, scientists, politicians, and drug tycoons shared information, you had to ask, let me first talk to my lawyer. Most of Western pharma's expenses are not even on R&D. They're on advertising drugs that have already been patented. Critics often point out the issue of biopiracy, where pharmaceutical companies will examine traditional medicines and patent certain compounds. In 1995, 2 American scientists of Indian origin discovered the medicinal effects of turmeric and were given a patent for it before the Indian government took them to court. Luckily, India won. Otherwise, every auntie would be using Bayer's original haldi, now with extra molecules. But another American company did successfully patent the use of neem in pesticides, despite this being used by farmers on the Indian subcontinent for, I don't know, thousands of years. In his book, Making Globalization Work, Stiglitz writes that almost half of the 4,000 plant products created in recent years by the United States pertain to traditional knowledge obtained from developing countries. Meanwhile, Western pharma spends billions of dollars creating drugs that will just sell, from opioids to weight loss medication, while people in post-colonial countries are plagued by diseases and medical problems that most people aren't researching. So in the last 2 pandemics, the same pattern arose. First, Western pharma put pressure on governments to block the sharing of vital medical information. And then those countries did some measly donation programs to soothe their consciences. And unfortunately, hate to break it to you, this is not the last pandemic. And Western pharma has already made record gains from each one, all for the sake of protecting innovation. But didn't people spend like hundreds of years innovating for the collective good of humanity? Not just to make sure that polysaccharide urolate isn't patented by Johnson & Johnson first? The inventor of the polio vaccine, Jonas Salk, was asked by a reporter who owned the patent to the vaccine. He responded, well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Give it 10 years, Joe. Give it 10 years.